Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the latest episode of Gibbo's Corner with me, Andrew Musgrove, and of course, John Gibson. And this week's episode, I think, is going to create quite a bit of debate. It is the Newcastle United legends who deserve a statue. Very simple title and doesn't need much explaining, but it comes on the back of a story that John wrote a few weeks ago. The Fairs Club are pushing for Joe Harvey, the manager who won Newcastle United their last major honour back in 1969, that being the Fairs Cup. They're pushing for Joe to have a bit more than a plaque up at St James Park, and he is thoroughly deserving of some bigger recognition, in my opinion, in John's opinion, I'm sure in the opinion of some of you guys watching and listening. And in this episode, we're going to look at why Joe is deserving of a bit more, but also going to look at a few Newcastle United legends who achieved a fair bit on the pitch and some off the pitch, and to see whether they deserve a statue, a stand, a street name named after them to honour their achievements at Newcastle United. Very excited for this episode. John, how are you keeping? You well?
I'm good. I'm good, and I'm looking forward to a bit of fun because it is a good subject and it's full of optimism and bonhomie, which is marvelous.
And it's full of your favourite thing as well, opinion, because we're going to
Correct.
have a bit of a debate. Those listening and watching will no doubt have a bit of debate, and they'll all have their own opinions on who deserves what. So I'm looking forward to it. And again, I just reaffirm it's not just about statues. I know that's the title, but we're going to talk about potential stands. We're going to talk about potential suites. But John's, done the business on this one, so you're going to want to stay tuned and listen to what he has to say. I mean, we'll start, John, at the very beginning with that story about the Fairs Club set up, I think it was 18 years ago, to honour the Fairs Cup win back in 1969, and they're now pushing, as we say, for a bit more of an honour to remember Joe Harvey's achievements.
That's right. A little while back, you may remember, Andrew, there was a plaque put up at St James's Park to the memory of Joe Harvey. It's a bronze plaque, and £10,000 needed to be raised to get this plaque at St James's. It was done through the Fairs Club itself, and I was as president of the Fairs Club, and that's an honour for me because it was such a wonderful time in my career, and it's the last time we ever won anything. As the president, I was there, and several of Joe Harvey's players, if you like, were there as well. People like Supermac, who was a terrific signing of his, Bob Moncur, who was his skipper that scored the hat-trick, and Vic Cable, who was in the 1955 FA Cup final winning side, which was the last domestic trophy of which Joe was coach at that stage. So that was put up purely through the fundraising of the Fairs Club, which is a bunch of Newcastle fans, and they've just felt that Joe deserved more than that. And if we run through very quickly to give these supporters an idea of what we're talking about, because we're widening it beyond the statue. That is obviously the ultimate accolade these days on any football ground. The greats have all got their statues. But let's look at what else we have currently within St James's Park, just to whet the appetite of the fans for who gets what. We know that there's 3 statues at the moment up at St James's Park: Bobby Robson, Alan Shearer and Jackie Milburn. The interesting one from that point of view is the first one, if you like, which is War Jackie. And because we as a newspaper were heavily involved in that. It was the Chronicle that actually decided to do something in recognition of Jackie, and we raised £35,000 through donations of fans. Just every fan from a tenner here to whatever they could afford donated towards that statue, which the sculptor was a lady called Susanna Robinson, and it was originally erected in Northumberland Street in November of 1991. It was the guest of honour was Laura Milburn, Jackie's widow, and a lot of teammates were there. I was privileged to do the mic work at the official unveiling in Northumberland Street. It then got took to another site outside of the breweries and eventually to St James's Park. The fun thing was, Andrew, that while it was in Northumberland Street, right in the centre, the heart of the city, there was a ball at the foot with Jackie just about to strike the ball. And the ball got repeatedly nicked by fans. It would disappear during the night, nicked by fans. And once it was actually found by a dog in Jesmond Dean. The ball was found in Jesmond Dean by a dog, which reminded me a little bit of when Pickles found the World Cup. Can you remember that? The dog found the World Cup. So, no wonder it's man's best friend. He found Jackie Milburn's football in Jesmond Dean. Eventually, as I say, it was rearranged and it's up at St James's, and of course has been joined by.
But I remember that. Yeah, just to jump in there, John. I mean, my first kind of memories of going to St James's Park was when the statue of Milburn was kind of on St James's Boulevard.
Yes.
And my lucky charm would be to run up and try to jump up and touch the ball. It kind of, I got there eventually because when I was a little lad, I couldn't reach it. So my dad had to lift us up. But that used to be my lucky charm. And it worked for so long because obviously when I started going, the demand was through the roof. You know, it was entertaining as a year and you couldn't get a ticket for love and the money.
Yeah.
And I had to go on my uncle's season tickets when they both had season tickets. And when they were either at work, me and my dad would kind of get a ticket. And so I'd probably go to maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 if I was lucky a season. But it worked for so long. And I always put it down to just touching the football on the statue. And that would be the first lucky charm that I always remember going to games.
You didn't nick it and take it to Jesmond Dean, did you?
Don't let the secret out, John.
But that was the start, and the other 2 statues come later, of course. But we have the 3 statues at the moment, which we all know, Robson, Shearer and Milburn. But there's been other things happening in honours of players. For example, if we look at the stand at St James's Park, the Milburn stand, I've seen Jackie seems to have started everything, bless him, and I can understand that because what a legend this guy was. The Milburn stand went up in 1987, and at the time of the entertainers and John Hall's Magpie Group taking over at St James's Park, the stand at the Leazes End in 1993 was called the Sir John Hall stand. It isn't anymore, but certainly Sir John's had a stand and Milburn's had a stand. In terms of suites inside the ground, and as you know, there's many suites that are just called the Heroes or whatever. But there's a Moncur suite, a Joe Harvey suite, a Sir Bobby Robson suite, and a Milburn suite. I think Jackie's got everything, bless him. He's got a suite, he's got a stand, he's got a statue. And what's not quite so well known, and this is interesting, I think, Andrew, we're talking about whether streets could be named after footballers. Well, Dan says yes, of course. And a lot of streets that are round grounds, like at Man U, etc., do carry the name of players, etc. But the interesting thing with Newcastle United is there's an estate of houses in North Seaton, which is next to Ashington. The whole estate is named after the Newcastle United 1955 Cup winning side. How about that? And I'll just give you an example of 3 names that are there. There's Keeble Court, after Vic Keeble, who was the centre forward then. There's Harvey Close, after Joe, who was 51, 52 and coach in 55. And there's Stokoe Drive. So Bob might have a statue with Sunderland, but he's got a street named after him in honour of Newcastle United in 55. That is not known by too many people.
No, I did not know that. I'm gonna have to go and take a look. That is really fascinating, actually. Just in terms of, because I don't know about you, but it seems in the last decade or so, this whole thing about honouring ex-managers or ex-players at Newcastle United, it's really come to the front. It's obviously come more into the public since the takeover a couple of years back. But growing up, I can't quite remember such a clamour for statues to be part of the club. I mean, so we talk about Milburn setting the tone, but before that, was there any was there any drive to have legends? And some of the
No,
legends that we've got written down here we're going to talk about, but was it a thing pre-1990 that people had to be honoured by statues?
no. Statues are virtually unheard of. This was the start of statues at all football grounds. Now, whatever football ground you go to, there's I mean, Manchester United have got Charlton, Best, and Law together. We've got Bobby Moore outside of Wembley. You've got the big names like Summerby and Bell and whatever outside of Man City. Liverpool have got Paisley and Shankly. They're two great managers. There's statues all over the place now, and that is quite a modern phenomenon. As far as Newcastle United are concerned, the man that broke the mold was Jackie Milburn, wasn't he? Because 91 was the first statue, which was chronicle orientated, nothing to do with Newcastle United, and was put up in the city centre in Northumberland Street to start with, eventually found its rightful home. But he had a statue, the Milburn stand, the Milburn suite. The farthest back we go in recognising players is Jackie Milburn.
He's got a second
That's quite.
statue as well, hasn't he?
Sorry?
He had a second statue as well. I don't know if it's still out and about, but he
Yes,
had
he did,
another
but
statue.
I think it isn't. I think it isn't now, but there was a second statue. You're absolutely right, and there was a third statue, but that, of course, is in Ashington, and there's a Jack Charlton one up there, etc. But we're talking about Newcastle United statues in honours to players at St James's Park.
Is there a danger that you can have too many statues?
Oh,
Currently,
eventually,
got
yes.
3. So
Eventually, yes. But I mean, if you go down to Arsenal, for example, I mean, I agree they've had an awful lot of success, but there's almost more statues at their ground than there is inside gated on match day spectators. It can get to that stage. The interesting thing with Arsenal, Andrew, is that while everything's modern, and the farthest we go back is Jackie Milburn, which is back to the 50s, which is not too recent, but is still within living memory of loads and loads of fans. There's a Herbert Chapman statue at Arsenal to their great manager in whatever it was, the 20s or 30s. So they have honoured as far back as that. There's not many clubs, or virtually none, I don't know anyone else, that has done that sort of thing. When I've been looking at names and putting them together with you, I'm thinking to justify something as huge as a statue, you've got to be extra special. You can't just be, somebody that was quite good. You've got to be a bit better than that. So I'm looking at the whole history of Newcastle United, which is 130 years, and the older ones now. The ironic thing, Andrew, is that the older guys that we talk about are virtually unlikely to get any honour like that because they're far too far in the distant past. But they're probably more worthy than most people of recent times for a statue if you just went on what they achieved at Newcastle United. And the first person we're going to talk about, for me, falls into that category.
Yeah, without question. And we'll start with the first name on the list, and it's Colin Veitch, 1899 to 1924. And I'll let you, John, take it away to why he's on your list as a potential person who's worthy of a statue.
Well, first and foremost, we're talking about the most successful period in Newcastle United's history, the Edwardian team. I mean, we won more championships and played in more cup finals than we have done ever since, I guess. And he represents the very best of the best from that period. The interesting thing is that while I'm saying he's from the dim and distant past, he is still treasured in the area. There's a Heaton group of people that are right into Heaton, which is where Colin lived, and they promote Colin Veitch at every single opportunity they can get, and quite rightly so, and pay homage to him. And in fact, talking about little things that we have, and we've talked about the Joe Harvey plaque at St James's Park, which we would like to now turn into a statue. There's a blue plaque outside of Colin Veitch's old home at 1 Stratford Villas in Heaton, because that is where he lived when he was Newcastle United skipper. And there's a blue plaque to this day outside of there commemorating the memory of Colin Veach. So there's already a small tribute paid to this wonderful man of Newcastle United. And we've got to, when you think of this guy, he is literally unique. This guy is literally new. Not only is one of football's all-time greats, and I'm talking about not Newcastle United greats, football's all-time greats. He served Newcastle from 1899 to 1926 because he became a trainer after he played. He made 322 appearances, scored 49 goals. That doesn't tell you everything by any means. He was the skipper that led Newcastle to 3 league championships between 1905 and 1911, 3 titles, and 5 cup finals. We only won one of them, but we played in 5 cup finals in that period. So you know how the double become quite a unique thing, didn't it? Into the 50s and 60s and 70s. Can anybody do the League and Cup double? We virtually did it every year. There, if you talk about winning the title and appearing in the cup final, only we didn't necessarily win the cup final, but we were up for the double virtually every year. The amazing thing about this fella, a total original, he played in every position for Newcastle, bar goalkeeper, left back and outside left. And I'm talking about position, not number of shirt. You know, right back, centre half, 2 centre halves, wing half, 3 forward position. Every single position he played for Newcastle, bar 3. He won only 6 England caps, but in 4 different positions. Every time he got an England cap, he played in a different position. And that's what held him back, because at Newcastle, he was so versatile. He played all over the place, and therefore he hadn't one single position to make an England position his own. He was the most versatile footballer in this country before the First World War. Now, and by the way, he was so good as a player, he was given a vote on picking the team. And as a player, while McCracken gets all the headlines for the offside rule having to be changed because Bill McCracken was the fullback that stuck his arm up in the air and played the offside and killed everybody, Colin Veach was in the think tank that devised that tactic as a means of making Newcastle great. But he wasn't just about playing football. He was the co-founder of the Players' Union, which he became chairman of, the National Union. He was so good politically that he was asked to stand for Labour as a politician up here, but didn't want to be an MP, so he didn't. He was the co-founder of the People's Theatre in 1911, the theatre that was in Jesmond. He was married to an actress, Greta Burke, by the way, which might have had something to do with branching into the People's Theatre. This is a footballer. He was a playwright, a composer, a conductor of an orchestra. All his friends were all famous people of that period, like George Bernard Shaw, who was his friend. He became a journalist. He was employed by the Evening Chronicle and got banned from Newcastle United because he was too critical in his match reports. Now that's a guy after my own heart. I mean, that is the definition of quality, because that, as a journalist, I don't mean you should go out to be banned, but you should go out to speak your opinion and stand or fall by it. And this is a Newcastle legend who was temporarily banned at St. James's Park for what he said. He was quite, I mean, he didn't have a couple of strings to his bow. He had half a dozen, and he could have become totally famous in all of them: a footballer, a trade unionist, an MP, in the People's Theatre, orchestra, journalist, you name it, he was it. And by the way, by 57, bless him, he was dead. By the age of 57, he'd contracted pneumonia. He'd gone out to Bern in Switzerland to try to recover. You know, Switzerland was the great place for people to go for the healthy air and coming off the mountains. And and he was out there, and bless him, he died while he was out there. But Colin Veitch to this day has huge support in the city through a society in Heaton, which promotes Heaton people. He's already been honoured by a blue plaque. And if we were going on what a guy has achieved and could achieve, what I've just read out now would automatically put you at number one. But it's so long ago that I doubt if it would be recognised by anything now. But by Jove, he deserves that accolade.
A very special character, and like you say, a real true great of Newcastle United. And it's interesting there what you've just said. It was so long ago, and you could argue the next two people on your list will fall in that same category. You could even argue to a degree Joe Harvey suffers from being a long time ago.
Sure.
And it's going to be really interesting how the club, if they do decide, to put up a statue of a Newcastle United legend, if they decide to name a stand after somebody, if they decide to try and, I don't know, maybe name a Strawberry Place after somebody, how they will go about doing that in terms of deciding who it is. Because you would think the right thing to do would be to open it up to the public. But
Absolutely.
Then if you put Kevin Keegan up against Colin Veitch, there's only ever going to be one winner because of the time. And that's not necessarily fair, especially when you look at the achievements of the players. And I was going to say this for later, but I'll put it out there now. I know there's a lot of people want a statue for Kevin Keegan, but for me, he's not up at the top of the list. He, obviously, and we'll get into it, John. He revitalised Newcastle as a player, came back, very nearly won the Premier League title as a manager. But when you're talking about Colin Veitch or you're talking about Joe Harvey, them two, especially Joe, in my opinion, levels above in terms of what needs to be honoured at Newcastle United. If you're basing it on silverware, if you're basing it on achievements, and you've mentioned Colin, Joe's up there as well. But we'll get on to Kevin in a little bit. But Hughie Gallagher next on the list, John?
Yeah, again, interesting. Because, quite a phenomenal footballer. He is the original, the number 9 legend that we talk about today, the number 9 shirt legend, which we have today, and we have a string of footballers that include Alan Shearer and Super Mac and War Jackie. They were started by this fella. Hughie Gallagher was the first number 9 legend of Newcastle United. It's quite phenomenal when you think about him. He was 5'5", but he was a barrel of dynamite. And by dynamite, I'm not just meaning scoring goals. He was liable to explode at any given moment. He had a huge reputation for fighting on the pitch, for brawls in bars in town, for going missing, sometimes before a game. They would go to London to play a game, and on the Friday night, here we would go missing, and he would turn up on the Saturday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and ask where everybody was and when we were getting on the bus to go to the match. He was quite a phenomenal character. And yes, he was a bit of a lad. In fact, he was more than a bit of a lad. He was a heck of a lad. And so should he be on it with a statue or with a stand named after him or a street named after him, or should he be? Because he was a naughty boy, there's no question. But then again, what is the level of decision to honour anybody? If we take it to the ultimate, what of the pop stars? The great life of drugs, sex and rock and roll. And by the way, Hughie Gallagher would see all these boys off in terms of drugs, sex and rock and roll. So should it stop Hughie Gallagher from becoming honoured by his football club? Because if you look at what he did for the club, it's quite phenomenal. He, first and foremost, can we think about winning the Premier League title at the moment? Not at the moment, but that's the hope of the new owners long term. Well, this was the last guy to do it. In 1927, which is nearly a century ago, Newcastle won the last title, First Division title as it was then. And this guy was not just skipper of that side, but top scorer in that side. That's how good he was. In all, for Newcastle United, in stats, can mean anything. But with goal scorers, they mean a lot because it gives you a sense of proportion. He played 174 games for us and scored 143 goals in 174 appearances. That's quite phenomenal. And if you look at the whole of his career, dating back to Scotland all the way up to retiring in playing in this country and playing for Gateshead eventually, in when they were a Football League side, he scored 463 goals in 624 games. Can you believe that ratio? I mean, it is quite amazing. I mean, obviously, I didn't know him as a player, and I'm very sad I didn't. The only thing about being old is that you saw lots of things that other people haven't. But it never qualified me with Huey. But I knew him ever so slightly. You know, when I was a little lad trying to start out at the Chronicle and a down table nothing at the Chronicle, he used to come in because he wrote a column for the Chronicle, and when he come in, and he was sober in an afternoon. He was the loveliest lad he could. He called everybody sir. He touched the tip of his cap if he was speaking to you. And take him across the road to the Long Bar to have a drink. And within an hour, he was wanting to fight the whole world, and he would have done, and he would beat them all. I mean, I got to know his son, Huey Jr., a lot better when I did a TV documentary a few years ago, maybe it's 20, a TV documentary on him, but as the great original Newcastle number 9. And I interviewed live in the documentary TV cameras Alan Shearer and Bobby Robson, who were delighted to be on because they were almost asking to be on because they were talking about somebody as great as Huey Gallagher. And Shearer benefited from the number 9 legends, and Bobby Robson told the great tale on camera about when he first went to St James's Park with his dad. All his dad could talk to young Bobby about was the proper centre forward that he used to watch when he was a young and himself, and that was Huey Gallagher, who was part of the infamous Wembley Wizards of 1928. That was the Scottish team, the international side, that absolutely took England apart. And I think Huey Gallagher was probably one of the biggest lads in the Scottish front 5, and he was 5'5". They were all titches, and they ran all over Newcastle. I mean, such was Huey standing up here with the fans. If I may point out, Andrew, for younger people, they might be listening to this. When he got transferred from Newcastle to Chelsea, and every time he was transferred, you know, it wasn't to do with ability, because ability was ginormous. It was to do with he was too much of a handful to handle off the park. So eventually you got rid, and we sold him down to Chelsea. He come back with Chelsea. Now, in those days, this the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s, in those days, there was no floodlights, quite obviously. There was no floodlights. So it was a midweek game. So he'd come back to St James's Park for a league game on a Wednesday afternoon, because there was no floodlights, when everybody was at work. And the attendance that day has stood as a Newcastle United record since 68,586, Newcastle club record, and 10,000 were locked outside the ground. And that was on an afternoon when everybody was at work, because there was no floodlights and how to play in the afternoon. But his greatest season, for what we've got to be thankful for, is 1927, when he was skipper, as I mentioned, and top scorer when Newcastle won the last championship. And that season, he scored 39 goals in only 41 games. He bust record upon record upon record. He was 5 seasons at Newcastle. He was the top goal scorer every season of those 5 seasons. And he was just quite phenomenal and freakish, because he was 5'5". Can you imagine a centre forward 5'5" these days? And he played centre forward, orthodox, in the middle, in your face, and he was taking on 6'1" centre halves and cutting them down to size. And he was good in the air because he timing his jumps. And like everything that goes into legend and into folklore, the position is cemented sometimes in tragedy, isn't it? You know, what transcends the normal run of the mill, even of great players, is some tragedy happens. And the tragedy with Huey was he'd come back up here to live. He always loved the Northeast. He was Scottish born, come to Newcastle, went to Chelsea, went all over the place, come back up here to play for Gateshead and lived in Gateshead. And how did he die? He committed suicide. That was a tragic, tragic ending to a superstar of a player who set all the trends at Newcastle United. He's still the last skipper to pick up the championship trophy for champions of England, and he started the number 9 legend. So whatever way we look at it, he has a case to be considered in the way that Colin Veach did.
Yeah, and I mean the goals itself, the goal ratio, the where he ranks in terms of Newcastle's all-time goal scorers. That's exactly why he's in the conversation, because he, just like you said, he was kind of the first real number 9 goal scorer. And I think for most fans, even though it happened a very long time ago, like you say, nearly 100 years ago, since the lift of that title, I think most fans have heard of him. They know at least of the stats. He's got a flag on the terraces, thanks to war flags. You know, he's honoured. But yeah, definitely deserves on the stats alone to be in this conversation about a bigger honour. We're going to move on now to Stan Seymour, a man many would call Mr. Newcastle because of his involvement as a player and then post his playing career. I am actually, when you look at what Stan achieved as a player and then as a manager and then further on from that, I am actually a little bit surprised that there isn't something as a suite or a stand named after him, because most fans of a certain age will call him Mr. Newcastle. I know you do, John.
Yeah.
So I am a little bit surprised actually that we haven't have him in this list, because when you look at what he did, he should have something
had there been statues in the time of the 50s, then you would have got Joe Harvey would be up there by now. Hughie Gallagher would be up there by now. Stan Seymour would. Colin Veach would. Because these fellas have got a much bigger claim than some people of the modern era we could mention because of what they did. But they did them long before clubs began recognising. But as I say, Herbert Chapman has got a statue at Arsenal, and he was from the era we've just talked about with Hughie Gallagher and Stan Seymour as a player. So why aren't these things possible? And the modern Newcastle, in lots of ways, can be traced back to Stan Seymour. And when we think, we've talked about what Joe's did, both as a manager and a player, etc., etc. When you think of the long career and association with Newcastle United Stan Seymour had, it is incredible. And he was known as Mr. Newcastle United. And I've almost, because I did know Stan well, I got to know Stan as a young reporter very, very well. This is Stan Seymour Sr., as you know, not Stan Seymour Jr., who became chairman as well later in life. But I mean, this guy was the outside left, by the way, to Hughie Gallagher's centre forward. They were teammates together. As a player, this guy was an FA Cup winner with Newcastle and a championship winner with Newcastle. He won the FA Cup in 1924 and he won the championship in 1927. He went on to be a director of the club, to be chairman of the club, and to be manager of the club. And he was behind the powerhouse. We talk more recent times about the rise of the entertainers and how Newcastle went from virtually going into third division to be the whole country's favourite side for the neutral because of the entertainers. This guy was behind the emergence of the modern Newcastle United, the powerhouse of the 50s, the rebuilding of the side, which was in the second division after the Second World War, to becoming the side that won the FA Cup 3 times in 5 years. Our last domestic dominance that we've ever had. And the man behind that was Stan Seymour. And so from that point of view, he is a giant in Newcastle's history. He was born in a little mining village of Kellow in County Durham, but he was made in Scottish football with Morton. which is quite unusual for an English footballer in those days. He made his name with Greenock Morton, really, where he was known as the Little Englishman. He was 10 stone wet through, another slight guy, but in 8 seasons as a player at Newcastle, he was the consistent outside left and the goal scoring outside left, who won the league and won the cup. You can't do much better than that as a player. I mean, if you take both milestones, the FA Cup come first, 1924. We got to the final. 1924, if you look in the history books, Andrew, was the year after Wembley first opened. Wembley first opened 1923 with the famous White Horse final, which you may have seen on YouTube. When the policeman on the White Horse, everybody was on the pitch because the crowd, there was about 200,000 in, and that was supposed to hold 120,000. And the White Horse patiently went round pushing the crowd back so that the match could actually start. That was then. 1 year later, we are in the final against Aston Villa. Sign of the times. How did all of, because the fans were as crazy about Newcastle them days as we all are these days. How did they go down to Wembley, this new, unique national stadium? They went down by steamer from the Tyne, down the coast, up the Thames, into Wembley. And the steamers heading down the coast from Newcastle were phenomenal. They're like taxis or ants crawling after each other down the side of the country. And it was in lashing rain. Aston Villa were the big team of the time. They were the firm favourites to win it. We were under the cosh in the rain for a long time. It looked like extra time. 10 minutes from the end, 0-0. Then we score a breakthrough goal, and the goal that finished off Villa completely was scored by Stan Seymour. So in 24, he's won the FA Cup for Newcastle. By 27, we've won the league title. Gallagher just come for 27. He wasn't there in 24. He come for 27. In both 24, when we played in the FA Cup and won it, in 27, when we won the league, Seymour was ever present both of those seasons. And when we won the title, while Gallagher was scoring the pile of goals we were just talking about, this guy who played orthodox outside left, which means wide left, scored 18 goals this season to help us win the title. From outside left in those days, that was something extra special. And when he stopped playing, again, I'm laughing because it was like Colin Veitch. The Chronicle had a fatal fascination for all Newcastle United footballers. Remember Colin Veitch joined Britain and got banned because who joined us later? Stan Seymour wrote for the Chronicle on Newcastle United. And what happened to him? Become persona non grata at St James's Park because he told a few home truths. Well done, Stanley. Proper journal. But the interesting thing was he was absolutely out on a limb. He opened a little sports shop on the corner of Market Street, which become known for donkey's years. He had that shop for an eternity, even when he was big time back at Newcastle. But he was in that shop, and Newcastle were awful. They almost went in the third division in that time, as they did in Kevin Keegan's time, just before Kevin joined us. And Newcastle United, in their desperation, turned to the man they'd ostracised, Stan Seymour, to say, will you come and rescue Newcastle? Now, he wasn't daft. He wasn't going to come as a manager and get the sack or something. He said, yeah, I'll come on the board and sort the club out for you, etc., etc. But you had to hold a certain number of shares in those days to get on the board. He didn't have any shares at all. But they were so desperate to get Stan, they contrived to find some shares, perhaps stuck on the top of a ledge somewhere in St James's Park, and they found their way to Stan, and he'd become a director of St James's Park. And that opened up a whole new being for Newcastle in what they become, because after the war, he was now the powerhouse at Newcastle. And, before the war, Newcastle didn't really have managers. They had the odd one, Cunningham, and the odd one, 55, Livingston, but they didn't have managers. And it was picked by a committee, the team. Can you believe that? A committee of directors picking the team on a Saturday? Dear, oh dear, oh dear. But when he took over Newcastle, he built the side. He made all the signings after the war. He signed Joe Harvey, he signed Jackie Milburn after a trial at St James's. He signed Ernie Taylor, he signed all the big names that played in the cup finals. He got them promoted into the top division, and we won the cup in 51-52. He was chairman, ex-player, and manager. He managed the team in 51-52. Douglas Livingston was manager in 55, but really it was still Stan. Livingston produced his team on the Thursday before the cup final on the team sheet and gave it to Stan. Stan looked at it, and in front of Livingston, scribbled it into a bowl and threw it in the waste paper basket and said, Newcastle United will not be represented by that team, it'll be represented by this team. And the reason he said it is because Livingston had dropped Jackie Milburn. The great Jackie Milburn, the goal scorer, if 2 goals in 51 when we first won the thing. And sure enough, Milburn took him 45 seconds to score, Milburn. So Seymour was vindicated straight away. But he was a real down-to-earth northeasterner, was Stan. He spoke with no sort of Toffs accent. He spoke the language of the ordinary man, and the cleverest football brain you could ever wish to meet. And he revitalised Newcastle United. His son, Stan Seymour Jr., became the chairman later, and was very famously chairman when we went and got Kevin Keegan and changed the face of Newcastle again. But Stan Seymour, when you think that he won the FA Cup and the league title as a player with Newcastle, that he become the director of Newcastle, chairman of Newcastle, and manager of Newcastle. There's not a lot of other positions left open to you, is there?
No, very true. A servant to the club, remained on the board of directors for 40 years up until his death in 1978. And like we say, just Mr. Newcastle. I mean, there's not more really you can say about that. I think Jackie Milburn was once quoted as saying that the club owe so much debt to Seymour for what he did. I mean, the quote is, there is a great debt owed to Newcastle to Stan Seymour for all the services to the club. And that's coming from a legend like Jackie Milburn. So that kind of says it all. And I think, yeah, he has to be in the conversation for whatever it be, a stand, a statue. I have to be honest, I'm not a big fan of statues. And I know this is the whole premise of this conversation, but I do think you can have too many, as I've already said. And there's not really that much. Where would you put in a statue at St James's Park? I know some might be saying, well, Andrew, there's a massive footprint there. But if you think about it, where would we even put a statue, John?
Well, there's plenty. I mean, at the moment, you've got the 2 statues standing guard as you enter St James's at the southern end of the ground. And they don't all have to be there. I mean, you can take them around to one of the other corners up at the Leazes end, if you like, or around the Strawberry Lane end. You're right, it doesn't have to be statues. There's clubs, and I take your point. You could actually justify having all the 5, theoretically, and all the 5 guys I'm mentioning here, and give them all statues, and you've already got 3, so you're on 8 before you start. But there's most football clubs like Man City, Man United, and Arsenal have got a lot more statues than we have. There's absolutely no question about that. And if you don't do statues, you do it otherwise. I'm not suggesting, I hasten to add, that all these 5 people ought to have statues. I'm behind. I think Joe Harvey deserves the one the most because it's most recent. It's the last one. He's done everything. Yes, some of these other guys Colin Veitch, and they've done as much or more as Joe, but you're going back over 100 years. You're not going to get too much happening there now, although some sort of recognition ought to be there in a role of honour or whatever. But these are the 5 people I think are worth consideration. It doesn't mean all 5 get statues. Otherwise, we can line them up and they'll look like a queue outside a Fenwick's window at Christmas when we want to see all the things in the window. It can get too much. But these, if you're going to start to pay recognition to Newcastle greats, be it through a stand named or a suite or the ultimate, a statue, these have got to be considered, at least considered.
Yeah. Well, we'll get on to your 4th name in the list, and we've already briefly mentioned him, and it's Kevin Keegan, player, manager, obviously still adored by the majority of Newcastle United fans, and it's always the name that kind of is at the top of the list when the debate has been had on social media. Kevin Keegan needs some sort of recognition, whether it be a statue or a stand. Like I said at the start of the show, I'm not assuring he does in terms of the names in this list, because I think it should be done on achievements. Some would then say, well, then, what did Sir Bobby Robson achieve? And I get that argument, because some people don't actually think Sir Bobby deserved a statue again in terms of what was achieved at the club. I guess the argument from the other side would be it's not all about achievements. It's about the impact that someone had on the club and had on the community and the city. And in that instance, there's no bigger impact probably than the one Kevin Keegan had, both as a player and manager.
Yeah. I mean, it's true. The lovely thing is, we said at the top of this podcast, Andrew, and why I enjoy these so much is it's a matter of opinion. And if we can stir interest among Newcastle fans, if we can stir debate, job done. Because Geordie's like nothing better than wallowing in nostalgia, wallowing in history, and having a great debate on who deserves what and who doesn't, and why not. And we will all disagree, and that's the way it ought to be. That's the way it ought to be. Now, as far as Kevin Keegan's concerned, he is interesting. He is controversial, if you like, for the reasons you've just said. He isn't controversial in terms of, if, as you rightly say, if there was a vote amongst fans, he would get a statue before Veitch or Gallagher or Seymour, because of the passing of time. They're distant names and dusty names in history books. This guy is still very much part of life. I think the one thing which you hit on there, which stands in good stead for Kevin, is that he deserves a statue more than Bobby Robson. Now, that's very hard for me to say, because I know Bobby very personally and I adore him. There wasn't a nicer man. I went and lived with him for 4 or 5 days in Lisbon when he was out there. I did talk-ins all over the northeast when he was manager of Ipswich in England. He was a dear friend. I've worked with and still work with KK a lot, and was around in the entertainers years. So it's very difficult for me to say. But if stats come into play, and you know that I'm not just a stats man, I like to rely on what my eyes tell me rather than what the books tell me. But if we go, there's 2 things in favour of Keegan having a statue, deserving a statue more than Robson, and that's only brought in because Bobby's got his statue. But Bobby, as Newcastle manager, the highest he ever achieved was 3rd. Kevin Keegan achieved 2nd, with having built the entertainers from the verge of the 3rd division to winning the 2nd division championship, to coming up and regularly being at the top of the Premier League and finishing runners-up, which still stands as our best finish in the league since 1927, when Seymour and Gallagher last won the championship for us. Keegan has got the 2nd best record of any manager at any time at Newcastle. Now, Robson only managed Newcastle and we won now. You can say Keegan managed and we won now, but we got to 2nd. And he also played for us, which is something, of course, which Bobby didn't do. Bobby would love to have done it. I mean, Bobby was a Newcastle United fan, much greater Newcastle United fan than Keegan ever was. He's become one since his 2 stints at Newcastle, but Bobby was a fan. But I don't know whether you get a statue for a fan, else we'd have 52,000 already, wouldn't we? The one thing I would say in his defence, if we're making out a case for Keegan, and it's my job to make out a case for all these 5, is the huge influence he not once but twice has had on the direction and the history of this club. When he came as a player, he woke up a club which was in permanent decline. It was going nowhere at a rapid rate of knots. We couldn't fill the ground, and you know how dedicated Geordies are to watching Newcastle play. We couldn't fill the ground when this guy arrived as a player. We didn't know what to do to get the public interested again. We're going through a cynical period, which we've gone through in our history many, many times. In one sweep of a pen, he changed all that. The next morning, there was absolute chaos in town of people twice round St James's Park queuing up for season tickets, which were not sold out, but were sold out that morning. Stan Seymour Jr., the son of Stan, who was chairman at the time, coming to the ground and he's gone, was so elated to see all the fans when there had been no interest whatsoever. He jumped out the car to wave to the fans, and his belt caught in the car wheel and his trousers fell down. And he's standing waving to fans with his trousers round his ankle. That's the sort of reaction Kevin Keegan brought at Newcastle United. And of course, as a manager, we've never had a better time in modern times, because we went from the brink of the 3rd division to second top of the Premier League, and in doing that, we built the entertainers who were loved by the whole of the country, by every neutral in the country. They were the favourite team. So that was a much more difficult start than the current regime taking over at St James's Park. Yes, we were in relegation fights when the Saudis and Amanda and the Rubens came in, but we're in a relegation fight near the bottom of the Premier League. We were at the bottom of the 2nd division, going into 3rd division when Keegan come in, when John Hall brought Keegan in. So the dramatic change, his impact on the club in 2 separate times here, and of course the wonderful PR. Turns out that his family was from Newcastle and his granddad was in the Stanley Pit disaster. So, I mean, only Keegan could handle his PR that way. He's terrific. I mean, he made himself a Geordie from that moment, and justifiably so. Now, you could argue that if Keegan was going to get a statue anyway, it could be at Liverpool, where he was one of the original level, or it could even be at Hamburg, where he was twice. They won the title in Germany, and he was twice voted European Footballer of the Year, 2 successive seasons when he was with Hamburg. So, you know, you could say he's due there. But Bobby Robson has got a statue where he thoroughly deserves one, mine, at Ipswich Town. There's no question about that. He's their number 1 man at Ipswich Town. So, you know, you can have a statue at more than one place. But I doubt if anybody has had the impact, both as a player arriving here, the instant impact, and the instant impact as a manager, is Kevin Keegan had. And he still stands with his entertainers as the modern day target for how the players and the board, that's what they've got to top, and then win something. But they've got to top him getting second top. That's the bar that's set in modern times. Because 1927, we'd be going to get the 100th anniversary before we repeat that, aren't we? And so he's the bar that's the next step for the current lot to hold. But I stick with Joe Harvey.
Yeah, well, we'll get on to Joe in a second, and I guess everything you've just explained there kind of alludes to why he is the often popular choice, and I totally get it. And just to be clear, obviously we weren't suggesting that it was a choice between Sir Bobby or Kevin Keegan. Sir Bobby had a massive impact on the club, saved them from what looked like certain relegation and turned them into title challenges. Okay, didn't finish second, but they went close, and he brought the good times back. And wonderful gentleman, he got what the club meant to to everyone because it meant so much to him, and he's deserving of a statue. Based again, as we say, like Keegan, on the influence and the impact that they had on a fan base, the way they reignited a fan base. But if we're talking on achievements, then there is no greater man who deserves an accolade such as a statue, perhaps a stand being renamed, which would be my preference, actually. I know the Fairs Club are trying to push for a statue. I totally get that. But personal preference, I think a name and a stand is in many ways a bigger thing than a statue. That's just my personal preference. But it's Joe Harvey. And it does annoy me, John, when I see people talking about not necessarily statues or accolades, but just talking about managers. And I think back to the build up to the Carabao Cup final, and it was all about Eddie Howe, and the questions were about kind of emulating Kevin Keegan. And I was sitting there thinking, we're there. You know, Kevin did a fantastic job the first time around, took them to within touching distance of the title. But Howe's not emulating Kevin Keegan if he wins this trophy. He's emulating Joe Harvey. That's who we should be talking about, because the last man to lift a major honour for this club as manager is Joe Harvey, and he always gets forgotten about. And I get the point about it being time. Time's not on Joe's side because it happened so long ago. But, you know, he needs more recognition for what he's done. He's got that plaque, but he's just a legend. He's a legend of the club. And Eddie Howe, when he leads Newcastle to a trophy, and that'll have to be next season now, it's Joe Harvey that he's matching, not Kevin Keegan, not Sir Bobby Robson. It's Joe Harvey. And that alone is exactly why we're having this conversation, and exactly why Joe Harvey deserves much more than a plaque, you know, round the corner from the club shop.
Well said, and I couldn't agree more with you. And one of the reasons I took when I was invited to be president of the Fairs Club, mainly because I'm still a working journal who was there when they won the Fairs Cup, and the only one still working on Newcastle United. So I was privileged, and one of the reasons I was privileged is I realised I was carrying the torch. I was the torchbearer for somebody like Joe Harvey, so that we don't forget about Joe Harvey. And you know, the fabulous thing about Joe that we must emphasise, the two great things he was great at was man management and his eye for a player. Because in those days, he didn't have a director of football, he didn't have a huge scouting staff. Joe picked the players, went and watched them, picked the players he was going to sign and signed them, and negotiated their contracts. The manager did everything in his day. And you can look back and say, Joe Harvey won things, and he had nowhere near the transfer clout that Newcastle United have got currently. Let's forget about financial fair play. We've still spent the right few quid on Bruno and on Isaac and on everybody else. There's a right few quid. We spend 200 million every transfer window, bar the last one, etc. And good for us. And he didn't have that sort of money. He didn't even have the money that Kevin Keegan had when he built the entertainers, because John Hall helped subsidise, and we were beating the club record fee on players all the way along. For every player we got, virtually, you know, from Ginola and Les Ferdinand and right up to Alan Shearer, which was a world record. When we bought Alan Shearer for Kevin Keegan, it was a world record transfer fee. That's the sort of financial clout Newcastle had at the time. When Joe Harvey was manager, following Jackie's days, and he was manager, he was buying Malcolm MacDonald from Luton, who had never played in the First Division. He was buying Terry Ibbott from Leeds Reserves. He was buying Terry McDermott from Bury. They all became superstars worth a fortune, but he unearthed them and brought them from nowhere. They were just among the pebbles on a beach, these guys, and he found them and polished them. He created three wonderful sides: a second division championship side, the European Fairs Cup winning side, and the FA Cup final side. He built three separate sides signing quality players when he didn't have tuppence jig. And that's the definition of a top manager. He didn't. I know you can splash money if you've got a load and spend it badly. Just look at Chelsea. But this guy didn't have the money of the current regime. He didn't have the money of Eddie Howe. He didn't have the money of Kevin Keegan under Hall when we spent the world record fee to get Shearer. He had peanuts, and he brought. Can you think of a better player? Terry McDermott from Bury went to Liverpool, won the European Cup time after time after time. Supermac, number 9 legend, Arsenal bought him, 5 goals in 1 international for England. 21-year-old out of Luton Town, never played in the top division. Tony Green from Blackpool, he went and got Terry Ibbott from Leeds Reserves. I mean, that is picking players, isn't it? Picking them up for peanuts.
Yeah, it certainly is, and we'll talk a bit more about his management because there's a lot to talk about. I mean, he was manager of Newcastle United for shall we say, a wee while, John, quite a few years.
Yeah. And by the way, in that time, which was a bad time for us initially, managers come in bad times, don't they? That's how they get the job, because we're doing badly, and we were doing horrendously when he got the job. And I think he was here 9 years, 11 years. There wasn't, with no money whatsoever. And not only did he win the second division championship, the European Fairs Cup, the Anglo-Italian Cup, the Anglo-Scottish Cup twice, which was the Texaco Cup, and get to the FA Cup final. In that whole time, there wasn't one relegation. In the whole time he was at Newcastle, like in the Ashley years, we went down twice, come straight back up. There was no relegation. There was all those pluses. There was all those trophies, as well as the ones he'd won as a player. And he's, to this day, the players that played for him, be it Supermac or all the rest, Bob Moncur, Frank Clark, absolutely adore him, because what he did for their careers was nobody's. There's one, Frank Clark. He signed him from Crooktown. He went on and played 480 odd games for Newcastle and was involved in all 3 of those great sides: the second division championship side, the first cup winning side, and the FA Cup final side. He bought him from Crooktown.
Yeah, great talent spot. And I was going to ask you in a moment, but I'll ask you it now because you've kind of mentioned it there. Was maybe the downside and maybe why he's not remembered more fondly, perhaps, not in the opinion of me and you, John, because our listeners and viewers know that I've got an obsession with Joe. I think he's absolutely brilliant. My aim one day is to write a book on him. I've already done that documentary, which you were part of, and I'll republish it because, I spoke to John Anderson, spoke to Supermac, spoke to Frank Clark, spoke to a host of people who played under him and worked with him, and such full of praise. But do you think the fact that the club domestically in the league didn't reach the heights that maybe they were expected to, it holds them back slightly in terms of the recognition?
I think it probably does in history now. But, you're saying we didn't reach the heights that were expected. We weren't expected to reach any heights at that time. We were expected to be a mid-table side. But we went on to win a European trophy and play in the FA Cup final. That was what was unexpected. But I know what you mean. When you get to the modern age and you look back, you want to see that Newcastle, like under Keegan, were second top, and under Bobby Robson were third top, and we weren't in that case. But I'll tell you something as well. And you've got to remember that Joe was brought up in the 50s cup final teams, wasn't he? In 51, 52, he was skipper, and in 55, he was coach. And I remember I did an awful lot of work with Jackie Milburn after he retired. I ghosted about 3 or 4 of his books. I helped get him This Is Your Life program, etc., etc. So I had a lot to do with Jack. And Jack said, you know what? You look at our league record in the 50s, and we did nothing special, because all we cared about was the FA Cup. The FA Cup to the Newcastle team of the early 50s was the be end and end all, because it had this superstar grand finale at the end of the season, and you had to be alive in those times to understand it. The young people now, the FA Cup's almost just something that happens, isn't it? By choice, and it's there. The FA Cup, I used to get up I'm talking about then. I used to get up in 9 o'clock in the morning and put the telly on BBC, and it would be on till 7 o'clock at night. The whole program, complete build up to the game and afterwards. And this was the way it was in the 70s and the 60s and starting with the 50s. And Jackie, you could win the league title when you didn't play because your greatest rival played and lost. So you've won the league title and you haven't played. But if you won the FA Cup, you did it at Wembley with the eyes of a nation on you and nobody else playing whatsoever. And Jackie said, we just concentrated on the cup. We wanted the glory. We wanted to be the glory boys. We wanted to go around the town with a cup on top of a bus and etc. etc. That is what motivated them. And Joe was brought up in that sort of atmosphere because that's what Joe did. He was skipper of all that. And so when we became us, he wanted to win pots. He wanted to win pots. And so he wanted to win the European Fairs Cup. And that was paraded on the top of a coach from the airport down to St. James's Park. He wanted to win the Anglo-Italian in front of 45,000 Italian fans in Florence, and we take the cup and parade it round the ground. He wanted to win trophies. He was obsessed by trophies because they were the biggest things in Newcastle's life in those days. It has now changed. The onus now is totally on the leagues, and if you don't win the league, you still qualify for the Champions League. So the Premier League has become what the FA Cup used to be. And Joe was all about, let's do the glory thing. I talked to Supermac the other day and he reminded us, and just an interesting story on this, the attitude that Joe had. He said, when we went to the 74 Cup final at Wembley against Liverpool, he said, Joe walked into the dressing room before the game. He said, I'm going to tell you something. He says, I have never lost a cup final of any sort ever as a player, a coach, or manager. Don't you lot spoil my record today. And his Superbank said, unfortunately, sadly, we did. But he'd won the FA Cup 51-52, coach 55, European Fairs Cup final, and even the small cup finals of the time. The Anglo-Scottish won it twice, Anglo-Italian won it in Florence. He always won cup finals till 74. And that is quite a record. And to do it with no money is quite phenomenal.
It certainly is. And the point about him being a player, an FA Cup winning player, is also really important. 224 appearances for Newcastle, 1945 to 1953, and to have two FA Cup winning medals in his back pocket is another reason why I think he's just set apart. Again, Kevin came in, reignited his city. You've talked about the queues around the ground. And it was brilliant to see, attacking football with Waddle and Beardsley and, lovely. But Joe Harvey captained Newcastle United to 2 FA Cups. That's what matters. Honours matter. And, Bob Moncur in the documentary that I've mentioned described him as Newcastle's greatest ever servant. And I don't think that's wrong at all when you look at what he did as a player and a manager. Do you think, John, that the Fairs Cup win, because I saw this mentioned last week, I think it was actually on one of the comments on the back of your article that you did, and someone mentioned or downgraded the importance of the Fairs Cup and kind of said it was a Mickey Mouse trophy. And that annoyed me because it certainly wasn't, was it?
Oh, that's a nonsense. With due respect to whoever said that, they just didn't know what they were talking about. If they mustn't have lived through it, or they certainly don't look at the record books, because that is the last thing. It might have had a Mickey Mouse name, like the Fairs Cup, instead of the UEFA Cup, which is what it became, which was much more deliberate. But it is, when you look, we had to get through 12 games without being knocked out. we beat sides like Glasgow Rangers, Real Zaragoza. We started with Feyenoord, who went on to become Champions League winners just after that. We played the greatest side in Europe in the final, Újpest. Now, people don't realise that today because it's a Hungarian side, and Hungarian football's nothing. But at that time, it was just at the end of a period where Hungary dominated Europe, both internationally. Their side reached the World Cup finals, it had Puskás, and club-wise, they were the side. And when we were playing Újpest in the final, people, luminaries like Bill Shankly and Jock Stein, who Celtic manager, etc., and Don Revie come out and said Newcastle United have no chance. They are playing the best side in Europe. They weren't in the Champions League because they were just on the way up again. But so they were in the second competition. And it was the second competition. It wasn't the Europa Conference. We're dying to get in the Europa Conference this season. If the first cup was Mickey Mouse, I don't know what that makes Europa Conference. But Újpest were the best side in Europe at the time. Let's give you an example. That season, the First Division Championship was won by Leeds United, Don Revie's Leeds United. Újpest beat Leeds United home and away in the European First Cup before they played us. Beat Leeds United, the champions of England, home and away. We beat Újpest home and away in the final. That's how good they were and how good a competition it was. And Feyenoord were enormous just because Feyenoord and Újpest and Anderlecht and Real Zaragoza and Glasgow Rangers on top teams now doesn't mean they weren't top teams then. And I mean, Glasgow Rangers went on and won the European Cup Winners' Cup and etc. They weren't too bob in those days, and that ought to be remembered. And you're right, people devalue things when often they don't know with utmost respect what they're talking about.
Yeah, you're spot on. And I did reply to this chap who commented and said that's an absolute scandalous remark because, as you mentioned, these teams they faced were some of the best in Europe. And I always remember the point about Leeds United struggling against Újpest as well. I mean, does the same apply to the Texarkle Cup and the Anglo-Italian Cup? Obviously, not a European
No.
European trophy.
In fairness, I wouldn't try to make the Anglo-Scottish Cup to be anything of huge importance. It's just one of those situations. If you're in it, let's win it. If you're in it, let's win it. And you're qualified to be in it. If you just missed out on Europe, then you were taken into the the clubs in Scotland and clubs of England that just missed out on Europe were taken into the Texarkle, which was the Anglo-Scottish. No, that was of no sense. But underrate the Anglo-Italian at your peril, because this was one-off games. They weren't like in Europe, home and away. They were one-off games. For example, we were drawn away to Roma. We didn't have Roma at home. We were drawn away to Roma and won. And in the final, we went to the final and were playing Fiorentina, who were a top Italian team at the side, in their own stadium. These were one-off matches. It wasn't even in a neutral stadium. It was held in Florence, in Fiorentina. 45,000 people in the ground were playing the local Italian side. And you know how tough the Italians were in those days. They were probably the best league in the world, not the Bundesliga or La Liga or whatever. They were Serie A, and we were playing them away. And because the final was in June, Malcolm MacDonald, our ace centre forward, was away with England on tour playing in internationals. So we had to play in the final of the Anglo-Italian Cup in front of 45,000 against Fiorentina, top Serie A side, in Florence, without a centre forward, and we won 2-1. Yeah. Now, that wasn't an easy ride.
Yeah, exactly. It's still worth, noting in Joe's list of honours and accolades, but obviously the Fairs Cup is the main one, a European trophy. Like, I don't have to say it here. I think we're both in agreement. Joe is tops this list of Colin Veach, Hughie Gallagher, Stan Seymour, Kevin Keegan is someone who deserves the next big honour, whatever that might be. Are you wanting, John, if you were the person making the decision, are you wanting Joe to get a statue, or you want him to get a stand? What are you after?
Well, I'm wanting to get him the biggest accolade possible. Whatever that is, in your mind, it's a stand. In somebody else's mind, I think it can only be a stand or a statue. I don't think, he's got a suite named after him. But then again, so have loads of people at St James's Park, with absolute total and respect to those that have, because that is extra special. But he deserves more than a plaque. A plaque that was raised by fans, not by the club. The club didn't think that he ought to be honoured. The fans did, and the club allowed him only to nail it against the wall. That was the only contribution from the club, and well done. Now, I'm not going to have a go at him for that, but I mean, he deserves an awful lot more than that. And, the Fairs Club is still going strong, and it's a bunch of hardy Newcastle United fans formed out of the joy of watching Newcastle win a European trophy in 1969. And it's still going strong in 2024. It is still meeting regularly. It has people like Michael Carrick, for example, who is sorry, not Michael Carrick, Vince Carrick, Michael's father, is in the Fairs Club. And the reason for the statue is that I remember the Fairs Club did, they had struck special caps, like international caps, with European Fairs Cup 1969 on, and the name of the person. And they presented that to each player. They just in the last 2 or 3 years, to each player that was in the squad and played in the Fairs Cup. And I had one with Joe, and they went to see Joe's son, Ken. And Ken wasn't so well, and he's since died. God bless him. God rest his soul. And in presenting him with a cap, Bill Gibbs and Harry Watson, the great forces behind the Fairs Club, said to Ken, "We'll do everything we can in our power to get your father a statue to recognise what he did for Newcastle United." Ken's passed away. They're still doing that, and more strength to the elbow. And the reason why they started to push it again was Darren Eales, and not so long ago, in passing in an interview, talked about, who do you think deserves recognition by the club from Newcastle's history? Thinking of the statues, thinking of other grounds to go to, and they walk up and they see Charlton Lawn Best, and they see Bobby Moore at Wembley, etc. Who deserves it at Newcastle? And the Fairs Club said, Joe Harvey deserves it. And with respect, and I adore Bobby Robson, and he's a very personal friend, so I would never dream of attacking him, and he was a breath of fresh air to us. But I would just say, if Bobby Robson deserves a statue, try telling me Joe Harvey doesn't.
No, I couldn't have said it better myself, and I didn't actually realise that Ken had passed. He was part of that documentary.
Yes, he has passed, Andrew.
Yes, that's sad news, and to really get a feeling of what Joe Harvey meant to this club and to the community, I do urge you to go and listen to the documentary if you haven't done, because
I'd put it out again, Andrew. I'd urge you to do that.
I will do it, because I mean,
it's topical now again because of the statue situation.
It certainly isn't, and Ken sat down for a long time with me and really like opened up, and it was remarkable to hear his story. So to hear his passing is terribly sad. But as the pitch, shall we say, for Joe Harvey to get a major accolade at St James's Park he's got to be top of that list. With all due respect, people listening and watching will have their own thoughts. There'll be people on the list that we haven't mentioned, but no one comes close to Joe Harvey, in my opinion.
The interesting thing, on just to finish off, and I would like to say one of the reasons for doing this, Joe was the reason. He was the peg, but it's a wonderful matter of opinion, and there'll be people listening to this shouting out names that we haven't mentioned. And I know, for example, somebody shouted out to me when I did a story recently. I think it was the Joe Harvey story I did about the first club, saying, "Would you, Gibbo, would you tell people how good Len White was? Would you tell people how good he was, and this was, and that was?" And that's wonderful. And if you were looking outside of that list of 5, there's all sorts of names which people might come up with. I'll just give you 3 or 4 now, just names. You Bill McCracken, who got his impact upon football was so great that the FA had to change the offside law to curb what he was doing, because he'd found a loophole to kill every side that played against Newcastle United. So there's Bill McCracken. There's Bob Moncur, who scored a hat-trick when the European First Cup was won. If you talk about the best players at Newcastle United, you would have to put Peter Beardsley and Bobby Mitchell in there, because there hasn't been a better player than Peter Beardsley if you were just talking about how good you are. And Bobby Mitchell was sensational. Bobby Mitchell was to Milburn what Stan Seymour was to Hughie Gallagher when they won the championship 27. There's loads of other names out there, and that's the wonderful thing. But these 5 we've picked today, I think, are up for consideration, serious consideration. And in my opinion, and I know it's yours as it happens as well, Andrew, there's nobody tops that list like Joe Harvey. And so I would say to the Newcastle United board, you know you've inherited a great club. That's why you came and bought it. You know what the fans are like. You're always paying accolades to them. If you wonder about Joe Harvey, go to the history books, blow the dust off the top, open the pages, read, then come back and tell me and the rest of the Geordies why Joe doesn't deserve any recognition.
Yeah, and we'll keep a close eye on the outcome of the Fairs Club's attempts to get Joe Harvey a statue. As I said, in my opinion, the Joe Harvey stand has a lovely ring to it, but if it is a statue, I'll not turn my nose up at that. Like I say, I'm kind of obsessed by him. I think he's thoroughly underrated by a lot of Newcastle United fans, and it is partly to do with history and time gone by. But hopefully, John, with the help of you and the Fairs Club, it can reignite a bit of interest, and those who maybe haven't paid too much attention to Joe's achievements can go back and have a little look. Because in the words of Bob Moncur, he is Newcastle's greatest ever servant, and in our humble opinion, he definitely deserves either a statue, a stand, something just to honor what he did as a player and a manager. Let us know in the comments what you think. Have we missed anybody out? What would you like to see Joe? How would you like to see Joe honored? Do any of the other names in that list that we've mentioned come above Joe in your opinion, of you guys watching and listening? We want to hear from you guys. We want to get you involved. Contact us on email at the EIBWpodcast@reachplc.com. I do pass on any of the comments I get to John. Thankfully, most of them tend to be lovely, and he does like to hear from you guys. Contact me on social media as well if you want to get in touch that way. Thank you very much for tuning in. Head over to chroniclelive.co.uk for all the latest Newcastle United news. And for myself and John, we'll see you guys next week.